being recorded.
Okay, welcome everyone to this week's OMR Architecture meeting. This week we have one topic that we'd like to discuss. So now that we have done our first release in OMR, we need to start thinking about how we're going to plan the subsequent releases that we're expected to do. So today we're going to have a discussion, I think a fairly open discussion around some topics around that, and we'll be guided by our project lead, Mark Studley. So.
No
pressure. Don't have my music.
All right. All right. So I confess I haven't done as much forward thinking on this as I would have liked before this meeting. So I've kind of been thinking about this since I started walking down from the 4th floor to come to this room. So there are a number of areas, and I forgive me for being disorganized as I'm just going to kind of start talking, and people stop, interject, ask questions, make suggestions as we go, because that will make this way more effective than just me dialogue or monologuing. Right. So we've done one release, which I've kind of used the phrase as a line in the sand for releases going forward. We've done one. Now we have to make some decisions around what kinds of release, what do we want to do going forward for releases? Do we want to plan a bunch of content, like changes that we want to make before we issue a new release, and basically decide the timing of releases based on when certain work items complete? Or do we want to do time-boxed releases? You know, sort of like how OpenJ9 does releases. They release on a schedule that's in fact determined by OpenJDK, which is kind of a quarterly release cycle. And then they do new feature releases every 6 months as well. We could, we don't have to do the same kind of time boxing that OpenJ9 does, but I think since OpenJ9 is one of our biggest consumers, we should be cognizant of what their release schedule is if we're going to come up with a different release schedule, and hopefully we can create something that at least, you know, reasonably well aligns with what it is that they want. And obviously we should solicit input from others that are consuming OMR at this point. You know, that might mean, so one way we could do that, which would kind of make it easier to have multiple consumers who all may have different release schedules, is we could do very frequent releases, right? We could do time-boxed releases every month, say, which I don't know if Eclipse would appreciate us doing it, but we could do it. It does put a bit of an onus on me as lead, because some of the release activities are things that only a lead can do, I believe. But if we're doing it once a month, then we're also not doing very much in a month. So maybe that's still manageable. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. You said that Eclipse might not appreciate that. Is it because they have...
There's process on the Eclipse side associated with this, right? So there's a
human has to get involved and do stuff. Okay.
So there's a limit to how frequently we could do this without really going over the top, right? So the release process requires a 1 week at least review, and then parts of the Eclipse review machinery have to sign off on the things that we're generating, right? So that takes some time, as well, a few days as well. So I think, you know, if we're not going to do pipeline releases, and I really hope we're not going to do pipeline releases, probably 2 weeks is the absolute minimum, but that would mean we're basically doing, like, we're constantly doing a release, and I don't think that's very practical either. Monthly is kind of that might be the right trade-off. I don't know. I mean, obviously OpenJ9 expects is releasing every approximately 3 months, but it's a little bit offset because the feature releases go out in different months than the update releases go in, right? So the update releases are in January, April, July, and October. and then feature releases are in May and September, right? So there's that March, April, and September, October, where they're 1 month apart, basically.
Sorry. Go ahead, Vijay.
Does anyone know what LLVM does?
2 releases a year. They're 6 months apart. They're pretty much timed modulo testing or other issues that cause them to push the time frame out, right? If they have a particular feature or something that they've decided is going to go in that release and it's not quite contained to the time frame, they will move the time frame slightly, but it's every 6 months, spring and fall.
Right.
And they usually time their 2 dev conferences in Europe and the US as around those 2 times. One question I did have is that one of the things that I think that's become quite aware to at least a lot of people who are working as committers is that there's a reasonable amount of functionality or a reasonable amount of variation in functionality in the different downstream consumers, right? And major changes are going to require, or we should be kind enough to allow those downstream the opportunity to kick the tires on those more major changes before we actually commit a release, right? And if we're doing monthly, my question is whether there's enough time for downstream open source projects
to
have a look at those major changes and to have a milestone,
right,
be able to revise it and agree that we've got something that's sensible before we release it.
So I agree with that. I guess I wouldn't necessarily expect every consumer to take every monthly release as one way that we could adapt to that, right? So the idea behind and I'm not saying that I'm necessarily in favor of doing monthly releases. I'm not trying to advocate for monthly releases. I'm just saying this is an option which would be flexible, right? So it means that you can have different consumers who might be interested in picking up a release at different times through the year based on whatever their release schedule looks like. And that might allow them to pick up whatever the latest and greatest OMR doodad is that they want without having to necessarily adjust their timing so much. But like I say, I'm not necessarily expecting that every single downstream consumer would pick up every single Eclipse OMR release and incorporate it as a release into, like, OpenGNI just wouldn't be able to do it, for one, because their release schedule wouldn't tolerate doing monthly releases. And the interim ones, I think, would be the right place for tire kicking to be occurring.
Right. But I mean, as a project, if we're calling something a release, it has to reach a certain level of polish, right? Like, if you look at, like, look to LLVM again as another example of a project that does do this kind of thing, like with their 6 monthly releases, right? Their feature freeze is usually sort of 2 to 3 months out with preview builds and release candidates and stuff, such that all the, I'm not saying 6 months is the right cadence either, but I just worry that there's not enough runway. Like, if I'm an open source project and I have my own large list of things to do, and OMR is doing things that are the right things for OMR that could break my world, I need to be able to make enough time to review those and vet those and do my testing against those and provide the feedback. And are we going to constrain people too much for the large pieces of work, right? If we're going to say that every month, we could drop a major feature in any one of those, is that the right thing?
Well, it also means that interim versions of things are definitely dropping into OMR and being released.
Yeah, without it necessarily being done. Which,
right? Yeah, I know it's a bit of a weird state, but I guess the agile way would be to it's disabled until it's really ready for prime time. But there are different ways of approaching this.
Given that the OpenJ9 consuming project need not pick up these releases anyways, takes whatever nightly it wants to.
Yes, that's true. That's what they're doing right now.
That's what they're doing right now, and likely to be what they do in the future as well. What is the significance of the monthly release anyway?
So I think it's a nice kind of seal of approval on like if we I don't know if this actually 100% worked with the first release that we did, but But for the 0.1.0 release, we chose the exact same OMR commit that the OpenJ9 0.17 release used. Now, they may have tacked on something after that as a small change to it. But in terms of what that release is, it's the one that's in OpenJ9 0.17, and it's the one that everyone in the Java universe who uses the OpenJ9 JVM will be kind of hammering on and using and leveraging. And, you know, it's kind of, that's, OMR gets to leverage OpenJ9's seal of approval on that thing in a way.
I guess if you went to that monthly scheme, though, let's say that we are looking at doing a much more major refactoring, right? Like, so,
Yep.
so we know that there are some of those that are going to need to happen, right? Like, we need to, like, we want to
Yep.
bring AOT infrastructure up into the compiler. We want to bring up persistent method info from OpenJ9 and factor it out, right? And various bits of Java that need to
Well,
push
even
down.
just Java, refactoring with other projects is also refactoring within OMR that we should be doing as well. That will be, they will take longer than a month.
And I guess, like,
have taken longer than a month.
How would you propose that the project manage the delivery of that stuff where it may not be practical to have the two implementations like sitting in the code, right? Like, some of these refactorings are going to be pretty hard to stage. Some of them do need to be sort of big bang, you know, here it is, wallop. How would we deal with that?
I think part of that is why we currently have the 0.x releases. It's to, I think, partly allow us to have that flexibility, so we're not making a promise that we're going to be stable across all releases. I think we should try to achieve stability whenever possible. But, right, like comparing us with LLVM right now, LLVM has full version releases. So they have much higher standards than we might have for our releases at this point. So later on, whatever we come up with, we could revise. So once we come up with a 1.0 release, we can have a more stable.
But, I mean, at the same time, if you are going to look to consume this technology, having random stuff just get up and move around whenever the hell it feels like it is not a great position to be in as a consumer, right? Like, if, you know, the OMR project committee can decide at whatever point, okay, hey, presto, major thing is landing, it's going to be in the next monthly release. I have to suck it or not, and if not, I'm going to be back level for a while.
So I think I'm willing to be overruled on this, or overruled is not the right word. I'm willing to have this contested.
if we were willing to step up to a monthly release cycle, I think we would also have to very seriously consider what the impact of those kinds of changes are going to be on downstream consumers, and we would have to look very hard at how we deliver those things, such that I'm not sure we could make the choice that you get one or the other, and sorry, you got to deal with it, because that's not going to be something that everyone will be able to tolerate, right?
And so I guess my point is, like, it would force us to think about that refactoring in a way in which downstream consumers can tolerate the intermediate steps, and that's definitely more painful for OMR on a problem that's already pretty damn painful to work on. So that, I mean, this may be like the issue that you're raising, and I think what we would have to do in order to support a monthly release, that may be, you know, sort of the biggest negative, one of the big negatives against doing frequent releases in OMR, unless, like, if we're doing continuous releases, I guess. So, I mean, we haven't even talked about whether or not we want to do continuous releases or whether we want to have service stream stuff. That doesn't fully mitigate the problem that you're talking about even. So, right, because OpenJ9, for example, does continuous releases, and so they would be picking up everything that's happening in OMR because they need stuff that's happening in the head stream. There's only one master stream, but anyway. of
The thing
OMR.
is, so that's kind of up to the project to decide, right? Is
Yeah.
It can decide either to pick up the stable releases,
Right.
stable-ish, or they can pick up whatever point they want. And
Yeah, I get it. I think OpenJ9, though, because of the way it releases, it would choose to pick up the master. And so you kind of, because it wants stuff that's in the master branch. It doesn't just want fixes. So if you want even one thing that's in the master branch, you're kind of forced to take it all, right? It's kind of a open your mouth and take everything.
Yeah.
The other thing that was one negative against monthly releases. The other is that I was thinking was we're talking a lot about functional stability in that. We also need to work on the API, especially for the compiler.
Yeah.
And if there is a lot of work there, you could potentially having that API change every month, which may not be a great situation either. So having less frequent releases would at least
where the API is changing by a lot. I guess I'm wondering, the further apart you make the releases, the less, the more painful it's going to be for consuming projects to pick up that release too, right? Like, it's not just the few things that are changing in a large way this month. It's all of the things that have changed in a big way in the last 6 months, say, as an example. Right, so there's definitely...
we have to find the sweet spot. And then even factoring things like we need burn-in time, or some downstream project we need burn-in time with the code and that.
Is there something fundamentally different about LLVM's consuming base that concern accumulate for 6 months and inflict it on the consumers is okay for them, but won't be okay for us?
I think they're in a different spot in their maturity.
They're way more stable than we are currently.
API-wise. But they also have more consumers.
Well, if you talk to people who work in the LLVM community, moving up versions in LLVM is a known painful operation because of the amount of stuff that does happen.
If the 6 months releases are viewed as negative by that ecosystem, that's worth stating explicitly.
I don't know I would go so far as to say that they view it negatively, but that moving up versions is known to be a lot of work. So people who live downstream from LLVM either have to have a team of people who are constantly updating their project with head, right? So there are some projects that follow head, and every refactoring and everything else that lands in it, they're immediately trying to keep up with it so that they don't have a big bang adoption. But there are other projects that do the big bang adoption. But when you do that, it can be 2, 3, 4 weeks of work for a small team of people to go through and do all of the refactoring that might be required, because while they're API stable, they still have new stuff added, and they are very aggressive in refactoring some parts of their API, right? If it's not clean, they change it.
And I think that they've been pretty liberal historically about just changing LLVM IR.
The IR is more stable now, but they've done...
I think it's more stable now, but it used to be changing.
Well, and they've done some really insidious things, right? I had to do an LLVM upgrade where they swapped the order of 2 Boolean parameters on a function. Right? That took us like a month and a half to find all the trues and falses were the wrong way around. Because there was no compiler checking. So, I mean, it's difficult. There's
All right. Well, we've discussed monthly. We've discussed
6 monthly.
6 monthly.
Quarterly?
Quarterly would be
it might be a stupid question. How often is the API changing right now? I guess in the public API, something like JIT-Builder that people might consume. Because you could probably do again, this is where the stupid question part comes in, is on a monthly release.
No, go ahead.
On a monthly release, if like the public API isn't changing, you could do a monthly release. But if you know that you're going to change something that breaks the API, you could push it a bit later. I don't know how easy that is to do, considering that maybe you need that API change now. I don't know. I was just sort of curious as to whether it has to be like a stable cadence or it can fluctuate a bit.
So I think it depends on the component you're talking about. So for the part library and for GC, I think the API is fairly stable, so it doesn't change. Robert or Andrew can correct me if I'm wrong. But for the compiler, the problem that we have is that we haven't really defined an API, so which is a problem in itself. And I think it is something that we need to make progress toward. But one of the stumbling blocks toward defining that API, because right now it's a very large surface area that the compiler exposes to other projects. We need to complete some of the internal refactoring work within OMR that we wanted to do to just basically clean up the various components of the compiler to get things in a better conceptual integrity kind of state. And then we can go about producing or forming an API around that. JIT Builder, I think, is an example of something that probably is closer to having an API that we could standardize at some point. But
it's more stable, but we have been changing things, and it's not a 1.0 API at this point either. Right? It is changing. In fact, there's some fairly major changes in implementation that I'm contemplating, which hopefully won't be API breaking, but could be. Certainly will add a lot of new API, may not break existing API. But anyway, that's not a discussion for this meeting.
I mean, then the question comes up, do we need a stable cadence now when it's still pretty unstable until things get better, and then you have a more like a quarterly cadence or something, right?
Yeah.
What's the benefit?
I guess you have to, in the end, we'd have to come up with like what's the trigger for us to do a release in that case, right? Like what are the criteria that we're going to use to say now is the time for a release? And I don't know. To my mind, this is going to be there's going to be some pain associated with doing a release for a while. You know, if we can get into a sort of regular habit of doing it, we'll get accommodated to that pain and we'll fix the hardest parts of that pain. So it'll be relatively easy to do.
Right.
And
I guess it just gets better over time.
Right. And so I guess we'll just get used to it, and whoever comes in to consume the project knows what to expect, and they can right, sort of work with it.
I have a
People are laughing at me.
For really very quantitative one. When you grab J9 project specific and return 0, it's the release. The next release.
That might take a while for us to.
Yeah.
That might be a 1.0 day.
Yeah, I've looked at doing just that. There's a lot of places where it's not trivial to move that piece of code, because you have like it's not obvious specifically what functionality that code represents. So coming up with a good extension point for that functionality ends up becoming a very mentally intensive exercise.
One of the reasons some of the stuff didn't happen before we open sourced it.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the easy stuff got dealt with already.
Right, and to move some of those things requires some of the refactoring that I was talking about to get some of the classes in a different shape. So that the code can
it's a great idea. I can't actually achieve that.
Certainly an excellent goal. Yes.
669 is the current number.
How many?
So we'll release next week.
0 dot.
Release target next week. Get it to 0.
So do one a week and
just rip them out.
One a week.
We've done it a decade.
All right. Well, so all of that, I think we're kind of we didn't really state it, but we're envisioning continuous releases. The other approach we could do is, which again doesn't completely mitigate the problems that we're talking about, but we could do quote unquote LTS releases and like have a service stream release where only fixes that are kind of reported against that release could be put there.
Wouldn't that be pretty difficult if you guys are refactoring master a lot, and then those places might be really difficult?
Oh, yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also a question of where does the effort to backport come from, right?
Yeah.
Are we going to make contributors do it as part of getting their contribution in, or committers going to have to do it, or do we have some pool of labor that I'm unaware of that we could exploit for said purpose? Yeah, there's figures around the room to give the answer to that.
I think it depends on the situation, though. Some of the contributions, if it's an obvious change that should be refactored in some way to make it live in one downstream project rather than OMR, then we should suggest that.
Well, it's probably a premature question given the number of consumers we've got right now who would be consuming a release and expecting fixes to be applied on that release branch. Right?
I don't think
There's nothing stopping us right now from doing that, right? I mean, we put 0.1.0, I created a branch, so in principle, I mean, you can backdate a branch anywhere, right? But so there's nothing stopping us from releasing a fix on any release in principle. I guess it's a question of whether or not the project thinks that's worthwhile. Maybe that's a premature question because we don't have very many consumers. So we can punt that one, I guess.
I mean, I think just from a maintainability point of view, I don't think the project is ready just because even if like we make it so that it's up to the consumer to do the fix, it will still be on the project to review the fix and make sure that it got tested properly and do the fix release and all of that. So there's still going to be an overhead for us. Yeah, those are my 2 cents.
So you don't like overhead?
I do not.
I get that. I don't like them either. Right. Well, I mean, all of this could be cart before the horse in principle, right? I mean, we could just decide for now we'll do a release in 6 months, and what happens will happen. OpenJ9 will continue on its merry way of taking commits from in the middle of those releases, and as we get closer to a point where we think it's more sensible to start talking about more frequent releases, if they're warranted, we can do that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You just did your first release. Maybe you're going to commit to something. You commit to one in 6 months. Get to that one. See if there was a need to do a more frequent one in that 6 month period, and come back and talk about it at that point.
Yeah.
So maybe if we're going to go that path. All right. Well, it's kind of an OpenJ9 centric way of thinking about this, but we could issue an OMR release that sort of predates the OpenJ9 feature releases by a little bit. That would be, there's only 2 of those. They're every 6 months. They're otherwise gonna, like, it kind of makes sense that is the newest brand spanking new version of Java that's happening every 6 months. So having that line up with an OMR release, maybe that's the right starting point
you
for us.
mentioned something about
alignment-wise.
about getting some benefit out of having the OpenJ9 release take the OMR release. Get that benefit at the feature releases, which are after all the.
Yeah, I guess, but those aren't the most used versions typically, right? Because they're not the LTS Java versions. So it's kind of whoever picks up, whoever's on the bleeding edge of Java might pick up those, but they tend to be less used than. But nonetheless, I mean, there's still some value there at least. I don't know what people think. So that would mean, I guess, March and September are when OpenJ9 releases. So kind of, I guess, mid-March, mid-September. So we'd probably want to try to cut our release a little bit, like end of February. So the first one wouldn't be 6 months away, but then we could go on to a 6 month cadence at that point, and until we feel like there's a point in doing something else, we could do that.
What is the quality bar for our release cut then, in terms of testing? Because we already run the maximum amount.
Yes, I know. Well, so Shelley has indicated an interest in making it easier for downstream consumers to do testing with early drops of OMR, like having ways of sort of using. I'm not actually sure exactly how she's imagining this will work, but trying to make it easier to design testing for downstream projects to be able to reflect the impact of things back into say OMR or into OpenJ9 in other cases. But she's actually looking at OMR from this perspective too. So I think if we're going to have a 6 month release cycle, then I think it probably makes sense for us to at least be notionally identifying what the big pieces are and trying to get those done. Okay, we need to talk about that too. But ideally, if you have a release cycle, you're trying to do big stuff early, and you're trying not to do as much big stuff right before. I'm unhappy with that statement as I say it, but anyway.
Well, it might make
because I know that's not how it works right now.
Well, it might make things easier for OpenJ9 in some ways, because at the moment they don't have any real direct control over when things land in OMR. So
right.
At least if we're cutting those releases, it gives us a justification
themselves, but yes.
Right, but it gives us a justification for holding off a larger change for a period of time because we're getting ready to release or whatever, right? And we're not going to merge something.
Right. I mean, in the end, I don't think we, as OMR, are likely to get a huge amount of, do a whole huge amount of additional testing ourselves, just because it would require, I mean, that kind of testing is really things that our stakeholders should be able to take out. So if we can enable via whatever ideas that Shelley's proposing, make it easier for OpenJ9, NJ, whoever else, all of the JIT Builder-based projects, make it easier for them to pick up a release candidate or a milestone build or something, and be able to feed back test results into the OMR project to say, I ran my tests and nothing went wrong. So this looks good from my perspective, that kind of feedback. I think as long as we leave enough time at the end of the release for that type of thing to happen, and we'll have to play it by ear how we do this, but we'll try to solicit, I guess, the feedback from our stakeholders on how well they think things are looking. And then, I think that's likely to be the best kind of feedback we'll get on the larger quality statement of an OMR release. What do you think? I can't read your face as you're listening to that, so.
It still seems kind of arbitrary.
It does, but okay, so do you have
can't think of
suggestions?
No, I can't think of anything better.
Okay. All right, well, it doesn't have to be decided today, right now, and locked in place for never more to be changed. But,
right,
so it's a topic I think we should continue to think about.
Yeah, and I guess if we were gonna follow this model and we're doing the next release at the end of February 2020, that would mean that we need to have some kind of a better testing story in place by then, which may not necessarily be realistic, but.
Well, again, it's something that we iterate going forward.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It is what it is in February.
Yeah,
It'll be what it is. It'll probably be
now.
something at least slightly better by August.
I think we're still early enough in the project release phases that we have room to experiment, and if things aren't ready for 0.2, then we do what we can with what we have.
One approach might be, in terms of how we measure the bar, is we sort of, it might be resource heavy, but close to the release, you sort of look at all your downstream projects, sort of ask them, hey, can you provide us a set of test cases? And it'll be ironic, it'll be like OMR pulling in OpenJ9, build the whole thing at first limit, but it doesn't have to be done every time. It would just be like the quality bar.
So I think what Shelley's looking at is kind of looking at that from the other side. It's what infrastructure and facilities can OMR provide that will make it easy for a downstream consumer to run a set of their own tests, like just pull in a particular release candidate build of OMR and run a set of tests on that and reflect those results back into into OMR.
Which would be fine. There'd have to be some way of OMR like sort of saying, hey, can you guys try this for us?
Right.
Yeah, well, so Shelley and I had talked about this, and we talked about a lot of things, but kind of, well, we basically came up with kind of two models, right? One is where we basically go to we would have some sort of subscription model where downstream projects would say, hey, please let us know when you have a release ready. And then when we notified them that the release is ready, then they go and run their tests however they want and then bring us back the results. Or we could make it so that by subscribing, they could provide something like a Docker image that just all it will do is build their project and run their test suite. and we specify which OMR commit it builds on top of, and then we can just grab whatever Docker images were given, run the test with the commit that we think is going to be our release, and see what we get.
Right. But wrapped in the framework that lets us be able to parse the release features and all that sort of, right?
Yeah.
Modulo having to make sure that the code actually builds.
Yeah.
There's some asterisk in there.
Yes, mileage will vary, batteries not included.
Yeah. Yeah, the subscription idea looks like a good one.
Well, that's the kind of model that LLVM uses for their testing, at least for platforms, right?
Yeah.
If you want to support a hardware platform, you can go and talk to them. They will give you scripts and stuff to put on your machine. You put your machine on, you run their image, you register it, and it will become a slave to the farm, and it will do what it's told to test, right? But like,
join the board collective.
Yes, exactly. You let your machine be assimilated, and then you're good to go.
Also, it's not like you test it for them. It's you donate.
You donate a machine, and they'll run whatever they need to against it, and you can donate tests and things like that, and they'll run those.
I see.
You complain that it doesn't work. Their suggestion is give us a machine, and we'll try it.
So I confess I'm not against less frequent releases, just because it's less onus on me and all that project leady stuff. But I did want to explicitly ask the people on the phone if they have any input into the process, because we've mostly been talking locally around the table here. So, Andrew, or Robert, I guess, is the main external person there. Do you have any? You don't have to. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but.
I mean, whatever we pick sounds reasonable, just as long as to revisit whatever decision we've made sometime in the future when we have a better understanding of what our needs are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, everything's going to change. So that's the only thing I can promise.
Well, I mean, there's nothing to say that we couldn't agree to do an extraordinary release if we felt that there was something we had to get out or wanted to make more public.
Yeah. There's no, there are no stone tablets being chipped on right now. So.
Okay. So
we can revisit any of this.
We're landing on 6-month release cycle, and whatever's in OMR at that point is basically how we'll just cut it how it is.
Yeah, and then probably with some type of milestone identified somewhat earlier in the release, whenever that makes sense. And I mean, I think it still does make sense for us to do some more. So if we can all kind of agree on that as the basic way forward, and seeing basically people nodding and Robert agreed, I'll document this in an issue, and we can do an official committer vote or something like that if we want to. I think it still does make sense for us to do a little bit more planning around releases so that people have a notion of at least the work that's going on at the project and what kind of delivery time frame we're trying to target for those things. I don't think we have to promise things in stone again, but I think it would be good for us to have a notion of what work is it that's going to be happening at the project that we know of and that people can add to if they show up and want to do stuff. That I'd love to see that. But having it kind of in a particular place, so using whatever milestone planning we can do on GitHub. I haven't set that up yet because I distracted on the things, but I can do that.
Okay, cool.
All sound good to everyone.
Yeah. One thing that I did like when I was working with LLVM is that in the lead up to the release, they usually send out like a 4-week and a 2-week warning for their, because they have a period of like, I think it's usually about a week or 2 weeks where they freeze ahead of the split so that major bug fixes and things or stability things can kind of be fixed in head. Then they split so that they minimize the amount of backporting, and they just have a short window where they're not in active flux.
Historically, we used to do a lot of that too.
Right, but having those warning emails and kind of going, right, we're now 4 weeks out from freeze, 2 weeks out from freeze. Okay, we're now in freeze, and that means this to the committers, and okay, and we're, and the split has now completed, and it's back to the next release, right? And sending those out like on the dev mailing list so that the committers and all the interested contributors can see that that's happening in a very visible way.
Right. So basically, there's a set of signposts
Yeah.
in the process, and
Yeah.
that's being communicated broadly through the mailing list about when those things are happening
Yeah.
for each release. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
It just made it really easy.
That'd be a good
to
use
plan.
for our mailing list.
Well, it just made it really easy to plan for things because you had warnings. So if it was something that you needed to get in, you could rush to get it done. Or similarly, if you were wanting to pick up something to test, you could go, okay, it's coming up, we'll get ready to do it.
So how does a feature become candidate for a release? So is it, if I come to the project with my code, do I say I want to contribute this for release 0.5?
Mm-hmm.
And we discuss amongst the committers and say, yep, that sounds good. And then
Good question.
get the milestone?
Excellent
or
question. What do people think?
Do we?
I think it goes to the milestone, whatever the next milestone is after it's reached the standard where it's going to.
Well, I think it comes down to where we are. There has to be some
Yeah.
consideration for where we are in the process, right? So if some big, massive thing that nobody knows anything about happens to show up in that 4 to 2 week period
Yes,
before the
well,
freeze,
exactly.
then
right, but that's
then
what
we have
that
to have-
period is for.
we have to
Right?
have
That's like
regulations
basically
about
the-
that.
Before you merge, you have to understand whether or not it's something that's worthy or that we think that would be worthy for that,
Right.
that release. But I guess the other thing is the size of the thing too. Like you said, big, massive, but what if little,
could be
not
one little
massive,
teeny thing. Yeah.
yeah, that we don't,
Right.
that might could be very,
Well, so what do people think? I mean,
But that onus is going on to the committers.
Yeah, I would have thought it would be a commit review thing.
right, but yeah, so that's.
yeah, so
maybe what I
it's
was
definitely the people who would be deciding this are, I mean, it comes down to whether it's a group of committers or whether it's the committer who's going to merge it, who's reviewing it and merging it. Or, it's like, is it just we devise a set of rules to handle most situations and we just follow those rules consistently across the committer group? Or I don't know, otherwise it's going to be,
Or by default.
given the number of pull requests that get merged in a week, it's not.
Or it could be by,
I don't want to have a committer vote on every merge.
Right, so I don't want to use the word by default, but by default, it would become part of the next release, except maybe if it met certain criteria in which it would need a committer review, perhaps a meeting such as this. Now, whatever that criteria is, it could be in terms of numbers of code, lines of code, or perhaps the state of entropy of the.
I would say that, like, the Eclipse process already has some of that with like CQs, right? Where it's like there's already this notion that
It's basically lines of code, though. And even
yeah, but what I mean
From an
is
external contributor.
yeah.
right, yeah. What I mean is there's already this notion that larger contributions have to be vetted in some way. This would be just something that, in my mind, we're just kind of taking that idea and applying it to a release.
But I mean, like, whatever the signposts are that we set should be the things that determine those changes in behavior, right? Whether it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks out that we start doing something different. Like, up until you reach that signpost, it should just be what we currently do is what we will continue doing, right? I mean, if the big thing is ready to go in, it can go in, and if it's going to cause, if it ends up causing some problem, well, we would currently either revert it or disable it or whatever. And then once you reach that 6 week mark, okay, well, then the bar goes higher. That big stuff won't, whatever the definition of big stuff is, that's not going in until the freeze is done, right? You reach the 3 week mark or whatever it is, the bar goes up again. It's only going to be fixes. It's only going to be whatever. Anything else, is tagged and just waits on the merge queue. And then
Yeah, I would actually suggest that we be a little bit even more overhead, slightly more overhead. But I think if we're going to go down this path, then so say 4 weeks out is where we because we don't want it to be too far out or else. But we want some time for downstream projects to be able to schedule the process of running these extra tests, right? So you don't want it to be like 3 days before we release because nobody will be able to do it on that kind of notice. You don't want it to be like 2 months because a whole bunch of other crap will show up and it'll have to, if we're not going to accept it, it'll have to sit and become stale. So maybe something on the order of 4 weeks, maybe. And at that point, I think we should basically do a okay, what other things are people hoping to land in the next 4 weeks? Give us the list and we'll go through it and decide whether or not we're willing. Like, you have to tell us about whatever it is that's coming. essentially, right? And get, like, because otherwise somebody shows up with a fix and it's like, well, it's 3 lines longer than the, criterion for being able to accept this thing, and it's only a day before, but yeah, maybe we could slide that. Like, it's going to be hard to kind of.
Another option is to trust the committers to use judgment at that point, not lay it down in black and white.
Well, sorry, it's not for the committers so much as for the contributors to understand that we're entering this process where we won't just accept anything, and if something big is coming, we want to know about it now.
Yeah, that part of it is fine, but we're not going to kick something out because it is 1,003 lines long. We're going to kick something out.
Just an example. I didn't mean it as a.
I'm saying there's no need to specify to that extent. There's a period. More scrutiny will be applied in that period. That's it.
I mean, I think that there's nothing stopping a contributor from opening a PR and asking the question, right? Is this something that could go in now, or should we wait until the release and then maybe ping a few committers?
Or it's even something that the committers, like a bunch of us are going through and tagging stuff anyway, even if we aren't actually doing the review. If it looks like something that does not fit the criteria, right, we can tag it as such, and if the contributor or the committer who goes to review it says, this is actually really important for the release, we really need to try and get this in, well, then you can go, okay, well, you need 1 or 2 other committers, or you need a lead, or whatever the rule we want to come up with is, needs to be added and needs to approve that particular merge. Otherwise, it has to wait until we're out of the release zone again, and then it's open slather as usual.
May need to get back together, say, in this forum when all this is approaching for the next release, and really, at least in a broad sense, have some sort of understanding of what it is that constitutes something risky.
Well, I think
let's be clear. I don't think we're deciding anything in this forum right now. We're having a discussion, which I'll try and capture parts of it. I know I'll forget parts of it, so I'll ask everyone here to contribute to filling in whatever bits my brain forgets between we having this meeting and me creating this issue. But I will try to do it soon. And then I think we need to have we need to make sure that our downstream stakeholders see this, right? Because this is a change that's going to impact particularly OpenJ9, right? Yep. Because OpenJ9 does have a habit of just contributing stuff whenever it wants to. And making sure that they're aware of the changes that, I mean, obviously we have OpenJ9 contributors and committers here, but the broader set, I think, need to be aware of the changes that we're considering here and making sure that we start socializing why we're trying to do that and what expectations they should have going forward. So we just make sure everybody's kind of on board with what we're doing.
It's very reasonable because there are OpenJ9 project leads who aren't committers here. There are OpenJ9 committers who aren't committers here. At least those people should have an opportunity to
voice their opinion.
I think the thing is that at some point we're going to need to open an issue with whatever the straw man proposals are for the 4-week and 2-week cutoffs, and what the rules are for what OMR committers are going to behave like at the 4-week mark and at the 2-week mark. And if they need to make an exception, what the process, what the convention is for doing that exception in a way where it's visible to the project and accepted by the people responsible for signing off the release. And as long as there's a document that says that, and we communicate on the dev list, we are in this period, and somebody opens a PR and we go, that's not going to fit, well, we can point at it that we're in the release -4 zone, and this is going to wait until after the release. We can continue to discuss it, but I won't be merging it until after the release branch is forked. Right, and then it's transparent. There's no, and if they want to debate that, well, they can make their case, and even at the project lead or whatever, if they don't agree with the committer, and then there's a final decision made, and that's it. Right? But it's all there for people to look at.
Okay. All right. think that's all I've got in my feeble brain for talking about this topic today. Like I said, I'll try to write down from what I'll do going forward from this is I will try to write down the net of this discussion into an issue, which I'll then tag into the agenda, I guess, and maybe even send out a note to the mailing list just because it is such a relevant project level topic. And then we can continue the discussion there. Like I said, if I forget anything or get anything wrong, please feel free to update the issue with the information that's right. And I'll tag some of the OpenJ9 folks just to make sure that we get the right feedback from them. I'll tag Dibyendo, I guess, since he's the other primary OMR consumer, as well as the people I know of who work on the various chip builder based ports that are out there.
And the RISC-V guys.
And the RISC-V guys, yes, good point. And we'll start collecting feedback. Obviously, if we're talking about a release in February, it's not super urgent that we decide this soon, but I think given that we've had this topic now, it's kind of hot in our minds. So let's set a let's see. So the next couple of weeks are kind of ugly with CASCON and all that prep and other things happening. So maybe something like mid-November or something, we'll try to drive to a conclusion on all of this so that at least we know what we're doing. And like I said, not written in stone tablets, but just kind of so everybody knows what to expect the next.
0.1 of the release behavior manual.
Yeah. 0.2.0.
We did the first release with no manual, so now we're going to try and write a manual.
We might have to have a manual for writing the manual.
We should have a committee for that.
All right.
Okay.
Other topics. I'm out.
I know that all program.
All right. Is there any more discussion anybody wants to have on this topic? No? Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for participating today. And we'll talk again I'm probably going to end up canceling the next one because it lies on a date that a number of us are going to be away. So the next one may actually be in early November or mid-November.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Well,
Bye.
Thanks, guys.